Okay, thanks for having me here this morning. And Habib, is always a very interesting presentation. And as you'll see from my presentation, if Habib fails, we'll all be underwater. So it's a good thing that he and his folks are doing the work they're doing. This presentation is similar to the one that I've given around the state on a number of occasions. Last to E2 Tech about a year ago, but since then I've given it a few times. What I tried to do about 2 years ago is ask this fundamental question, that is, can we eliminate carbon from our economy without bankrupting Maine? That is, do it in an economical way so that we can afford the transition to a zero carbon. I mean, if we don't do this, then obviously we're not going to be able to do it elsewhere in the world. And if we don't do it elsewhere in the world, then we're all going to face serious consequences from global warming. What I show in the book is that it is possible to do it in Maine, and nothing about what I'm doing here is specific to Maine. It could be done in other states just as well, as you'll see. But in order to do it, we have to be smart about it. I mean, if we are not smart about how we make the transitions and how we deal with the decarbonizing process, then it's going to cost us a lot more money. In addition, there are certain sectors where it's going to be very difficult to make the transition. And as I'll talk about, I've assumed that we are able to rely on new technology to wean us from carbon. But the consequences of making this transition can be managed in terms of its financial impacts on all of us. The transition requires 5 things. It requires a lot more, but the 5 things that I focus on here is first, beneficial electrification. That is moving our entire economy to electricity. In some instances, that's a fairly simple thing to do technologically, transportation, heating. In other areas, you know, making cement down at Dragon or making paper up at Sappi, that's in the process sectors of the economy. It's a more difficult thing to do, but we can do it. If we electrify the economy, then what we have to do is decarbonize generation. Doesn't do us any good to drive Teslas if the energy that we're putting into our batteries is generated by coal. So what we have to do is we have to decarbonize generation. And the way in which my modeling does this is through 3 technologies: solar PV, onshore and offshore wind. I don't rely upon things like fusion or nuclear fission. Like, I don't rely upon wave technology, geothermal. I mean, all of those things may evolve over the next 30 years, but currently they're just not feasible technologies from an economic perspective. The 3 that I focus on here are, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along. We also need very large-scale battery storage systems. The wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine all the time when we want to use electricity. But again, if we're careful about how we do this, and Habib alluded to this during his presentation, if we're careful about how we do this, we can minimize battery storage, which is the most expensive component of the transition. As you'll see, making this transition requires a very different electric grid. And so what we need is an electric grid that has historically looked like a city's water system, where all the water comes out of Lake Sebago and it gets distributed through pipes to end up in people's homes. We have to transform our electric system from that kind of a system where power is flowing in one direction only to a system in which we have a network, much more like the internet than like our water systems or our sewer systems. And lastly, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this near the end. What you'll see is that this transition requires very significant and in fact unprecedented amounts of capital investments in order to make the transition occur. Habib mentioned some of where we get our energy use today, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, but this is the energy that we have to displace. This is where we're currently drawing most of our energy that's not biomass. We're drawing it from, fossil fuels, coal, distillate oil, those kinds of things. When we go to beneficial electrification, what's going to happen is we're going to use a lot more electricity. Currently, and RNS is a technical term, but our current electricity use is around 12,000 gigawatt hours a year in Maine. I'm not going to spend much time talking about what that means, but for those of you who have some background in electricity and utility work, you understand. If we convert all of our space heating, that's residential and commercial, if we convert all of our space heating to electricity using air source or ground source heat pumps, we are going to add about 7,500 gigawatt hours. So we're going to increase relative to where we are today, our electricity use by about 65%, give or take. Those heat pumps will give us more air conditioning, but that's a fairly trivial amount of increased load. Our process loads, and this is all of our industrial loads, things like the lime kilns at Sappi, the cement manufacturers, all of the stuff that undergirds our manufacturing and our industrial and our commercial economies. If we replace all of that with electricity, it's going to roughly double the amount that we're currently using. And lastly, if we replace all of our gasoline and diesel fuels that we use in our vehicles, passengers, buses, and trucks, we're going to increase our relative to the current amount of electricity by about 67%. And when you add up all of this electric use, we're going to go from 12 to 40, or about 3.5 times the amount of electricity. Now, that's okay because we're reducing the amount of gasoline and heating oil and propane and so forth that we use to zero in this modeling activity. So we're moving everything over to the grid. And what happens is that our load shapes on the grid, what the electric grid has to accommodate, is very different. The blue line, or the blue area down below here, shows the amount of current electricity consumption. That hour by hour, beginning in January, going to December, that we currently use. Everything above that is incremental use. The orange is heating loads, and the orange loads are very important in Maine because you'll notice that they occur in January, February, March, and then November and December. They take what in Maine is a relatively flat electricity use pattern today and turn it into one which is very spiked and seasonally in the wintertime. Process and charging loads are laid up on top of that, but that's the load shape that we have to meet by 2050 if we are to completely decarbonize our economy. Underlying this is an assumption that we will become more efficient in our use of electricity, but that efficiency, conservation, if you will, that efficiency is offset by growth in the economy. So what we're doing here is, or what I'm doing here is assuming that all load growth in the future, more houses, more people, more whatever it is that we use for electricity, will be offset by increases in energy efficiency. Now the transition from here to 2050 that I'm assuming follows a traditional, S-shaped diffusion curve. This is what I've assumed for passenger EVs. So I've assumed that by 2040, for instance, about 50% of all cars on the road will be electric vehicles. They will be 100% by 2050 because I'm forcing that as the constraint. Similarly, for residential heating, it lags a bit, but ultimately it's got to get to 100% penetration and all of those other things that we have to convert. The yellow line here is industrial process. And again, each process requires a different technology. Most of those technologies don't exist today. And so what I've assumed is that most of this, well, almost all of this industrial conversion happens out in the future, 15, 20, 25 years from now. But again, by 2050, we eliminate carbon from the industrial footprint in Maine. This is what we have to meet when we do that. This is our load shape that we have to meet. And the question is, can we do that using renewable energy? That load shape is reflected in these bars month to month. So this is the monthly load in January, February, and so on. And really, it's not the total load, it's the percent of the annual load that occurs in January. And so you can see the seasonality that appears once we beneficially electrify all of the sectors of Maine. And that's what we have to meet in terms of generation. The sources of generation that I rely upon first is solar. And that's shown by this yellow line. This is the percent of annual generation in Maine from solar projects that occur in each of the months. And as you can see, solar is very good in picking up this June, July, August, and September electric load, but it doesn't do a very good job at all in the winter periods, not surprisingly. So if we had to rely on solar, we would have to build an awful lot of solar in the summer, put all this extra power into batteries, and then release it during the winter and late fall periods. The green and the green and purple lines here show the same patterns, but for onshore and offshore wind. And you can see that in Maine and in the Gulf of Maine, the patterns for wind generation are almost perfectly countercyclical to the patterns for solar on a seasonal basis. And that's very convenient because we need that power in the winter. What this means is that we don't have to build as much solar and batteries. We can build onshore and offshore wind in order to accomplish the objective of meeting that load shape. The blue line here shows the same information for our existing hydro facilities. I've allowed those hydro facilities to continue into the future as a source of energy. They generate roughly, of that 40 that you saw in the previous, they generate roughly 3.5. So it's less than 10% of our generation, but we continue those hydros in the future. They do very well in the spring runoffs in late March, April, May. They don't do very well in the summertime, and then they pick up again in the fall when we have, again, more rain and runoff that occurs. So if you look at a combination, and we'll get to this in a moment, of these technologies, it's possible to reflect this load. Now, it doesn't do it perfectly, never will. And so what I've done is I've said I'm going to use battery storage to match the hourly loads and hourly generation. So whenever there's a mismatch, we're generating a little bit too much electricity during an hour, we put it into a battery. And whenever there's too little, that is, we generate too little energy to meet loads, we take it out of the battery. So we're balancing this huge system off of batteries. And that handles hour by hour. It handles diurnal cycling, the stuff that you see in California, during the duck curve. We get this big dip in load and then a big increase in load in the evening hours. You're balancing that diurnal daily cycling with batteries. Plus, you got multi-day problems, right? There are days in Maine when it's just calm as can be, but cloudy and foggy and overcast, and you don't get much generation. It can last 2 or 3 days, 4 days. So you need to be able to draw on batteries during that period. Fortunately, because of our generation mix, if we're successful in building it out, the seasonal variability is less important because of that offshore wind. To put this in perspective, if we had to balance our grid, if all we had available to us was solar, we would, starting in January, we would have to draw down our batteries till we got to this low point. Then we would put energy from the sun into our batteries till we got to this high point. And then what we would end up doing is drawing off of our batteries till we get to back to December. There's about 7 million megawatt hours of battery storage would be required to balance our grid if all we relied upon was solar. To pay for that would require 100% of Maine's income every year. We couldn't do it. It's just financially impossible. Technologically, you could certainly do it, but financially, it's impossible to do it. If we add onshore wind to that mix, you can see we're helped a lot. We need much fewer batteries in order to balance our load. And if we put in offshore wind and we overbuild our system, what we can end up with is a battery requirement that looks like this gray line, which is very, very small and affordable. So what does this generation look like? Well, there are lots of options. I mean, in fact, there's an infinite number of scenarios that you can draw upon. I drew on one scenario. And what I said was, let's say we build out 7,500 megawatts of solar PV, 2,500 megawatts of onshore wind, 5,000 megawatts, 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. What we'll need is about 250,000 megawatt hours of battery storage in order to balance that combination of resources. Right, we'll have a little bit of extra in the summertime from the solar. We'll have a little bit of extra in the wintertime from the wind, but this combination of resources will allow us to meet that generation or that load profile that I described earlier with all those seasonality factors and daily factors and so on. In the modeling, what I do starting in 2020 and going to 2050 is we build out a lot of that solar first because the technology is available at a reasonable price. We build out a lot of the onshore wind fairly linearly because there probably won't be, and for Maine, there won't be much in the way of technological advances that allow us to lower the cost of onshore wind. Now, part of the reason is because whatever technological advances we get, we lose in locational disadvantages. The one thing about wind is that these earlier projects get built at the best wind sites, and we don't have an infinite number of good wind sites in Maine. So we build out onshore wind fairly linearly, but what we do here is we delay the offshore wind to make sure that Habib gets it right, that we have the technologies that we need from these demonstration projects so that as we go to scale in 2035 and beyond, we can build out much more rapidly with a technology that, as NREL is forecasting, is declining in price because of all the experience and expertise we draw upon. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but these are the numbers that I use as cost drivers to get the final results. We spend on energy, and this goes back to 2020 through about 2016, we have spent on energy roughly $6 billion on average every year. This is all of our energy. We've been as low as a little bit above 4. We've been as high as 8 billion in that run up when oil prices and natural gas prices increased post-Katrina, but pre-fracking. But 6 billion is roughly 10% of our gross state product. Gross state product's a little less than $60 billion in real terms. And all these numbers, by the way, are in real terms. They're discounted for inflation. So that's about what we spend currently. So the question is, can we do this transition that I just described, staying within that $6 billion range? Because if we can do that in real terms, it's affordable. If we try to do this and this cost looks like it's going to be 12 billion or 15 billion, and we have to devote 20 or 25% of our incomes to provide for energy, then we're all going to move to better places to live. And we're just not going to put 20% of our income into energy. I mean, we saw what happened when people were talking about $200, $300, $400 a barrel oil back in the 2005, 6, 7 period, when people were talking about peak oil and so on. Now, it was a very scary proposition for Maine. People were talking about having to burn their furniture to stay warm at night during the wintertime. So we have to do this at a cost-effective basis. If we don't, we're in trouble. And what I've done in the analysis is looked at the annual cost of that build out that I just described over the next 30 years. And the answer is that we can do it, but we have to do it carefully. Our cost picture changes remarkably during this period. Today, roughly 80% of what we spend on energy is fuel. That's this gray area here. This chart, by the way, is the same as the green bars over here. They're just broken down by source. The blue is what we pay to deliver our electricity, and these other bars are what we pay for the energy itself, the electricity itself. But we're roughly 80% fuel. As we do this transition, what happens is we reduce the amount of fuel cost down to zero. We replace that with a build out of the grid, right, in order to handle all of this new energy electricity that we have to deliver, with a build out of our renewable generation projects. This is the 7,500 megawatts of solar, the 5 gigawatts of offshore wind, and the battery storage that we need in order to handle the ups and downs and the irregularities of load relative to generation. But when you look at these costs, virtually all of these costs, the storage costs, the generation costs, and the utility costs, are all capital related. They're all for equipment. That is all of the wind turbines here, all of the solar panels. They're upfront costs that are invested with energy being delivered over time at close to a zero marginal cost. So this transition goes from one where we're spending variable costs on fuel, out-of-pocket costs, to one where we're spending a lot of money on capital. In this world, we care about our fuel costs. We look around for the cheapest fuel we can find. We're always looking for cheap natural gas, cheap oil, cheap coal, whatever we can find. In this world, what we have to look for is cheap capital. Where can we find cheap capital? Because if we have to spend a lot for capital, what's going to happen is this is going to be too expensive. The amount of capital investment that build out that I just described, the amount of capital investment by where it is each year, what kind, the type of that investment is shown on this graph. Over time, we will spend in real dollars a little less than 60 billion, with a B as in baseball, $60 billion to get to 2050. A lot of that's going to be on offshore wind. A lot of it is going to be on solar. A lot of it's going to be on the grid. A lot of it's going to be on battery storage, but it's roughly $2 billion a year. Now, we rely upon utilities to do this, or private venture capitalists to do that. It's going to be very expensive for us to undertake this transition because their money is 8%, 10% money. If on the other hand, we figure out a way to use vehicles like the Maine Turnpike Authority, which borrows money at 3% for 30 years, or even less in today's environment, to handle that $60 billion, then we can afford it. And the numbers that I have used in my calculations rely upon build out using 3% money. If we build this out using 8% money, the costs will be twice as high as they are, and we'll just find it too expensive to do. We have to find cheap capital in order to accomplish this. But even if we do this, even if we get to 100% electric vehicles, even if we get to 100% heating in our homes, electric heating, all of that, if we do it over the pattern that I described, and we build out all that generation, this is what our CO2 reductions look like. Think of Maine's economy as that proverbial QE2 out there in the ocean. You don't turn it on a dime. It takes a long time to get this stuff going. And we have to be patient in the early years, but we have to have a plan to get it done. And it's going to take a while for it to occur. Habib is not going to get his first turbines, in the water till about, till about here. Maybe we'll get that research array in here. Maybe we'll get the first, 100 or 1,000 megawatt project out here. It takes a long time to move this. The same thing is true with electric vehicles and with heating and industrial processes. But there is a path to get us to 2050 and to do it without bankrupting Maine. You can find a copy of the book online. I encourage you to take a look at it. If you have any questions about it, this is my email address. I'm happy to engage in dialogue with you about it. I'm not going to be thrilled about arguing why we can't build nuclear plants in Maine, but if anybody wants to talk about issues related to the book, please feel free to drop me an email. And as I say, I'd be happy to answer any questions offline if that's a more convenient way of handling it. So with that, Phil, I'll stop my presentation and turn it back to you.